Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Critical Theory of Police Power, the Fabrication of the Social Order, by Mark Neocleous, narrated by Liam Gerrard. Introduction to the Verso edition. A power absolute and indefeasible. Satan, her friend, inspired her with a terrible fear of the police. She was full of anecdotes about them. According to her, the police arrested as many women as possible in the hope of earning bonuses. They grabbed everybody and silenced you with a slap if you shouted, for they were sure of being defended and rewarded. This fear of the law, this dread of the police, was such that some women would stand paralyzed in the doorways of cafes while the raid was sweeping down the avenue. Nana listened to these stories in growing terror. She had always been afraid of the law, that unknown power. Emile Zola, Nana, 1880. "They bombing on us now," a local musician shouts. "They bombing on us now, and they got us blocked in from the other side. Are they shooting? Not quite," another person explains. "It's tear gas." The place is Ferguson, Missouri, in August 2014, and the context is the confrontation between the police and those protesting against the police killing of Michael Brown. The quotations come from a report on that incident in the Washington Post on the 14th of that month, but the refrain, "It's tear gas," has in recent years become a familiar theme in news reports. Tear gas has been used against pro-democracy campaigners in Bahrain, Occupy protesters in Istanbul, Hong Kong, and various American cities, those fighting for electoral reform in Uganda, students campaigning for educational reform in Santiago, anti-austerity protesters in Rio de Janeiro, school children in Nairobi protesting against the destruction of a playground, pro-democracy campaigners in Egypt's Tahrir Square, fuel subsidy campaigners in Nigeria, Buddhist monks in Thailand, Palestinians in the territories occupied and controlled by the Israeli Defense Force, Kashmir students in Srinagar, farmers protesting during the Tour de France, and prisoners in large numbers of America's jails. This list could be much longer, but there's more than enough here to suggest that tear gas is clearly a popular weapon of choice for the state. This begs a question. What is tear gas? The question is political, not technical. How do we make sense politically of the state's use of tear gas against its own citizens? The standard answer to such a question is the one found in the Washington Post report just cited, and goes something like this. The fact that a chemical agent once used in warfare, but now banned by the Chemical Weapons Convention of 1993, is being used by domestic police forces shows that policing has become focused less and less on the needs of the community and more on the execution of militarized violence against the state's own citizens. This use of tear gas is a sign of the militarization of policing and indicative of the rise of paramilitary policing. In this vein, tear gas is invariably connected to the use of a whole range of other technologies of violence about which exactly the same claim is made, from water cannon to drones, stun grenades to tanks, body armor to armored vehicles. All these technologies have led journalists, academics, and activists to insist that what we are witnessing is, to give just a few of the formulations, the militarization of policing, a new military urbanism, the development of a paramilitary policing juggernaut, the militarization of law enforcement, the normalization of paramilitary policing, cops acting like soldiers, and armies in blue. This police paramilitarization thesis, as we might call it, is a sterile argument, one which acts as a blockage in critical thinking about the police power. Much of the problem can be seen in the use of the para. The para is clearly meant to point to something important, something usually technological, but also something that points to an important shift. Hence, discussions of paramilitary policing are almost always discussions of its rise, just as the militarization thesis implies that policing is becoming militarized, suggesting a break with the past in which police and military powers were more clearly defined and categorically distinct. As well as suggesting a historical break, the police paramilitarization thesis also contains an ethical and political claim, namely that the police power should have no connection to the war power, and that, when a form of technology that appears to be more appropriate for war zones is used by police forces, something has happened in which normal policing has been surpassed, with the police becoming something else, not quite fully military perhaps, but paramilitary. Inherent in the idea of paramilitary policing is the assumption that normal, that is, non-para policing, is not about violence, but about something else, usually security, law and order, peace and tranquility, the good of the community, policing by consent rather than through coercion. The thesis thereby perpetuates a beautiful fiction, that the police power and the war power are two distinct forces containing institutions that can and should be kept apart. The thesis thereby panders to part of the mythology of the liberal state. The police power deals with crime, whereas the war power fights wars. The police power keeps the internal peace, whereas the war power defends the nation from external threats. The police power manages civilians, whereas the war power confronts combatants. The police power confronts situations of law and disorder, whereas the war power confronts an international enemy. The key question that emerges from this myth, which then becomes part of the myth itself, is to ask how the institutional differentiation of these two powers is to be regulated in order to avoid the drift towards the kind of police state with which militarized policing is associated. Even a cursory knowledge of the history of policing reveals just how close the key institutions of the police power and the war power have been. Take any of the technologies listed before, and one finds that they are born into the world of police power. As soon as tear gas was invented, for example, it was used by French police against Parisian gangs prior to World War I, by a range of states in policing their colonies in the 1920s, colonial war yet defined by such states as police actions, and being recommended by instructors of police science as an effective weapon against unruly mobs, crowds of civilians, and groups of agitators. Tear gas has been a police technology since its inception, and the same can be said of other technologies of violence with an equally long history, such as water cannon or more recent technologies such as the drone. This historical use of technologies of violence by various state departments is merely part of the institutional overlap between those same departments, and should be no surprise because the technologies were invented as technologies of state violence, and the state has never cared that much whether it should use a particular technology for only certain types of people or certain types of problem. The shock, amazement, and horror that tends to accompany reports of technologies being used in this way lacks any critical awareness of the fact that the technologies in question are born into the police power because they are invented by the state and its corporate clients for that very reason. At the same time, the key institutions of the war power and the police power have been entwined since their inception. In the US, for example, the police power grew out of the slave patrol, which was itself conceived of as a militia force. The police force, widely taken as the first quintessentially modern and professional force, and the one on which many later forces were modelled, the Metropolitan Police, established for London by Sir Robert Peel in 1829, was modelled on military forces to the extent that many of the first officers were former military men, including one of the first commissioners, Charles Rowan, who was a former lieutenant colonel, and the force was to have a military structure. Hence, the usual terms used in the history books to describe Peel's force are pseudo-military and quasi-military. When this system was transported by the British state to manage the colonies, after having been brought to the metropolis from Peel's experience managing the English colonial war in Ireland, the label generally used to describe it was semi-military or paramilitary. This historical overlap is also part of the reason why police discourse is replete with the language and ideas of warfare. Leading police treatises Texts in police science, media statements made by senior officers, and ethnographic work among rank-and-file officers inform us time and again of the constant police wars being fought against the disorderly, unruly, criminal, indecent, disobedient, disloyal, and lawless. The most obvious of such wars is the war on crime, but there is also the war on drugs, the war on gangs, the war on vagrancy, the war on poverty, and the war on disorder, all merging most recently, though to varying degrees, with the war on terror, and together forming a plethora of overlapping, interlinked and permanent campaigns which go some way to explaining why so many different oppressed groups refer to the police institution as an occupying army. Such police discourse reveals that the police institution has always seen itself as involved in war-fighting, which is also why police officers time and again refer to themselves as the thin blue line, or in the front line against armies of various types. Take any police text, and one is almost guaranteed to find this kind of claim. For example, A. E. Costello writes in Our Police Protectors, 1885, that the police is considered as an army for preserving domestic order in time of peace, just as the regular army protects us from foreign invasion in time of war. And so the police, in the designation of its men and officers, and also in their appointment, suspension, trial and removal, should be organised and governed according to like features in our military system. The police machine is expected to keep in subjection the army of criminals whose energy is untiring, whose evil influences are ever-living forces, and who are a constant menace to society and good government. One of the leading law texts on the police power, Christopher Tiedemann's Treatise on the Limitations of the Police Power in the United States, published a year after Costello's book, discusses the army of discontents that exists among the citizenry. The most significant faction of this army is the labouring class, to the extent that a key police function is the regulation of industrial warfare. Or, as a third example, take, from the same period, Theodore Roosevelt's approach to policing New York during his time as police commissioner for the city, in which he made clear that the industrial warfare between capital and labour and the unending war against crime requires police officers operating as soldiers on the field of battle. The police service is military in character, he claimed, advising officers to keep before your minds the military service of the department, and to maintain the military virtues learned in their Civil War experience. This was an idea which he held through his presidency. The war we wage must be waged against misconduct, against wrongdoing, wherever it is found. This narrative of war in the discourse of police takes us back to the structures of police organisations, which undertake drills and contain divisions, chains of command, squads, details, sergeants, captains, majors, and colonels. All of which begs a question. If the police power is at war, what is it fighting about, and who exactly is it fighting? One answer is provided by internal mission briefings produced by the Missouri National Guard during the policing of the Ferguson protests, obtained by CNN in April 2015 under a Freedom of Information Act request, which revealed that the National Guard were expected to treat the protesters as enemy forces. This was later changed to criminal elements in order to avoid the negative connotations associated with the language of enemy forces. But the change is itself quite revealing, for two reasons. First, because the idea of the criminal as a creature at war with society has been a foundational claim made in bourgeois political thought since its inception. But also, second, because the Department of Justice's investigation of the Ferguson Police Department found that in 2014 over 16,000 people in Ferguson had outstanding arrest warrants, which was nearly the whole population. In other words, almost the whole population of Ferguson was likely regarded by the police there as a member of the enemy forces. A second answer is provided by the former head of the Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, Daryl Gates, which he offered on the 4th of March 1991. The date is significant because, the previous day, officers in the LAPD carried out the infamous beating of Rodney King, in which King was shocked with a 50,000-volt taser and then beaten so badly that his skull was fractured and brain damaged, ankle and cheekbone broken, teeth knocked out, and kidney damaged. On the 4th of March, however, the video footage of the incident had not yet been released, and so, instead of having to deal with the fallout from the beating of King, Gates was in attendance at a summit on crime and law enforcement organised by the Attorney General. In a panel discussion, Gates built on what he regarded as a key proposal for police work, which he spelled out for the general public in his later autobiography, Identify the Enemy. At the panel, he observed that it is often the case that identifying the enemy makes us very uncomfortable. Why? Because the enemy happens to be a great many of us. Claims such as this reveal that police wars interpolate citizen subjects as objects of threat, as enemies or potential enemies, and that it therefore makes perfect sense that, in those moments where the threat appears most explicit, all the paraphernalia of state violence can be used, from tear gas to water cannon, from batons to guns. They reveal not only that the police power is always already at war, but also that it is at war with an enemy within. The problem with the police paramilitarization thesis is the same problem that haunts so many of the other key debates about policing, which is that it takes for granted a set of assumptions about what policing is meant to be, and therefore what it means to police, or even to be policed. But because the assumptions that it takes for granted are precisely the key assumptions of liberal ideology surrounding the police, the outcome is a sterile contribution to a series of banal debates about civil liberties and police reform, variously focused on organizational structure, procedural fairness, accountability, transparency, justice, and the rule of law. Such an approach obscures the fact that policing is about much more than the police, just as war is about much more than the military, and that the police power, as we need to call it, is first and foremost a weapon of the state. What the police paramilitarization thesis ultimately reveals is the failure of its proponents to fully appreciate the police concept inside and as part of a theory of the state. In contrast to the kind of reformist arguments rooted in a debate about civil liberties, the rule of law and the possibility of democratic control, which is where most of the debates end up, and which never deal with the problem pointed out by John Lee and Jock Young some time ago, which is the danger that democratic control of the police might end up leaving the police looking exactly the same. We need to start not with the standard questions, such as how should the police be organised? Is it acceptable for the police to use tear gas? Is it right for the police to be armed? What is an appropriate use of police discretion? And so on, but with a different kind of question entirely. What do we talk about when we talk about police power? As the first edition of this book sought to make clear, and as I want to pursue a little further in this introduction to the new edition, this question takes us to the heart of capitalist order, to the violence of the separation of workers from the means of subsistence, to the constitution of wage labour, to the management of political subjectivity, to the implanting of law and order into our hearts and minds, and to the ingraining of security into our souls. A critical theory of police power, then, demands a materialist analysis of the capitalist state. Conversely, a materialist analysis of the state also needs to address the whole logic and power of police. The first principles of police. In an exchange with Bruno Bauer over the Jewish question in the early 1840s, Marx takes up the question of rights. This was an important issue, not simply because it was key to Bauer's argument about the status of the Jews, but also because of the historical significance of the various declarations of the rights of man announced in the late 18th century. Marx's observations in this regard are well known. He points out, for example, that the rights in question might be revolutionary in some liberal ways, but are nonetheless the rights of egoistic man, of man separated from other men and from the community. In other words, they are rights achievable by members of bourgeois society. Article 2 of the most radical constitution, the Constitution of 1793, declares that the key rights are equality, liberty, security, property, and Marx works through these ideas, suggesting that liberty appears as simply the power to do anything which does not harm others, and is thus the right of separation, of restricted individuals withdrawn into themselves. The practical application of this right to liberty is one's right to enjoy one's private property without regard to other human beings. This right of self-interest makes human beings see in others not the realization of their sociality and freedom, but rather the barrier to them. Such observations essentially launch Marx's well-known critique of rights discourse through the rest of his work. But what is of interest is a comment he makes about the right of security. Security, he says, is the highest social concept of civil society, the concept of police. Marx has put his finger on a core feature of bourgeois ideology. In a capitalist order, security is the supreme right, because it is security that guarantees the preservation of property. For this reason, security becomes the key concept underpinning the idea of police. Marx's comment, brief as it is, has a number of dimensions. For a start, it picks up on the long tradition of bourgeois thought which had made precisely this point about security and police, as is shown in the early chapters of this book, through a discussion of the work of Adam Smith, G. W. F. Hegel, Patrick Colquhoun, Edwin Chadwick, and a whole host of lesser-known police scientists. Second, in pointing out that security is the highest concept of bourgeois society, Marx completely explodes the tedious debate that takes place within political theory, jurisprudence, and criminology about a supposed balance between security and liberty. It is quite clear from any reading of the history of bourgeois thought that security overrides liberty every time. Hobbes, Locke, Smith, Ferguson, Bentham, Hume, and Paine, to name but a few, all hold the kind of view articulated by Montesquieu in The Spirit of the Laws, that liberty consists in security, or at least in the opinion one has of one's security. In the liberal mind, liberty is essentially subsumed under the idea of security. It is for this very reason that liberty always gives way to security under the declaration of a state of emergency, and why every liberal constitution allows fundamental liberties to be suspended in the name of security. Third, Marx is getting at the idea that, because the self-interest generated by bourgeois society makes us see others as a barrier to our own freedom, so we come to see other members of civil society as a threat or source of harm. In effect, bourgeois society turns each of us into a source of the other's insecurity. Finally, Marx's observation allows us to read the permanent disturbance of all social conditions and relations that attends the constant revolutionizing of capitalist production, described so well by him and Engels in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, as an order of social insecurity. These dimensions generate what turns out to be a fundamental problem for capital: how to maintain a secure and orderly capitalist system amid its obvious insecurity and disorderliness. Hence, the order of social insecurity gives rise to a politics of security, and, in this politics of security, the police power is central. The fundamental problem for capital turns out to be the fundamental question of the police power. If Marx had ever managed to develop the theory of the state, which was hinted at in his early work, and to which he alluded at several points in his later work, that theory would have contained within it a development of the critical observations on security in his early work, which would, in turn, have unfolded into a critical theory of police power. His historical knowledge of capital's use of different types of labour, from colonial slavery to wage labour, meant he could not have failed to notice the centrality of the police power to all regimes of capital. Likewise, his philosophical understanding of key works in political theory meant he could not have failed to notice the centrality of the police power to bourgeois thinking about the state, especially in those works which deal more openly with the fundamental antagonistic nature of bourgeois society, such as Hegel's Philosophy of Right, about which more is said in Chapter 2. Marx's starting point, however, would not have been with the question of whether the police power is militarized, unaccountable, discriminatory, undemocratic, and so on. He would have taken such things as read. His starting point would have come from within the critique of political economy. It is pertinent to note that, in his attempt to deal with issues surrounding crime in the very early stages of his career, Marx moved swiftly from the question of specific crimes, such as the theft of wood from areas which were not yet fully held as private property, to the study of law and state power more generally, which he then put on hold as he immersed himself in the development of the materialist conception of history and the critique of political economy. That is the gist of the biographical sketch of the 1859 preface. But a critical theory of the police power, conducted via the critique of political economy, takes us into nothing less than what Marx calls the innermost secret of the bourgeois order. What we find, then, is that the question, what do we talk about when we talk about the police power, points us towards the hidden basis of the entire edifice of capital. It points us, first and foremost, to the secret of primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation is the process that constitutes capitalist social relations as the separation of the bulk of the population from the means of production. This process is of obvious crucial historical importance, since, without separating workers from the means of production, capital could not have come into being. Without such separation, there can be no capitalist accumulation. For such a separation, workers must be free in a double sense, free to sell their labour power, but also free from ownership of the means of production. They must be free to the extent that they have nothing to sell but themselves, and must be free to sell it. Capital demands, let there be workers, and sets about forging them, by forcibly removing them from access to land, driving them from their homes, turning them into vagrants and vagabonds, and then passing a series of laws through which they are chastised, whipped, branded, and tortured precisely because they have become vagrants and vagabonds, a disciplinary process designed in turn to make them as amenable as possible to their new condition as wage labour. This is the basis for Marx's citations from the bloody legislation of vagrancy acts and early labour laws, directed at those seeking to maintain a living beyond the wage relation. He cites a statute of 1530 to the effect that beggars too old and incapable of working were to receive a beggar's licence, but sturdy vagabonds were to be whipped and imprisoned. They are to be tied to the cart tail and whipped until the blood streams from their bodies, and then swear an oath to go back to their birthplace or to where they have lived the last 3 years, and to put themselves to work. In 1547, a statute ordained that anyone refusing work shall be condemned as a slave to the person who has denounced him as an idler. The master shall feed his slave on bread and water, weak broth, and such refused meat as he thinks fit. He has the right to force him to do any work, no matter how disgusting, with whip and chains. If the slave is absent a fortnight, he is condemned to slavery for life, and is to be branded on forehead or back with the letter S. If he runs away 3 times, he is to be executed as a felon. The master can sell him, bequeath him, let him out on hire as a slave, just as any other personal chattel or cattle. If the slaves attempt anything against the masters, they are also to be executed. A further statute, passed in 1572, required unlicensed beggars over the age of 14 to be severely flogged and branded on the left ear, unless someone will take them into service for 2 years. In case of a repetition of the offence, if they are over 18, they are to be executed, unless someone will take them into service for 2 years, but for the third offence, they are to be executed without mercy as felons. Under James I, anyone found wandering about or begging was to be declared a rogue and a vagabond, publicly whipped and imprisoned for 6 months for the first offence, and 2 years for the second. Any such rogues who refused to change their habits were to be branded with an R and set to hard labour. If caught begging again, they were to be executed. Similar laws and measures were passed across Europe, such as the French Ordinance of 1776.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?